It is now my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speakers, Sarina Lacey and Dennis McCarthy from the Centre for International Economics, CIE. Back in 2022, to give you some context, the FRSA board made the decision to deliver a major piece of research. This research would provide a contemporary picture of the economic value of the family relationship services sector. We know that is not the only measure of our worth and something we will explore more in the panel later on this morning. But given the board knew that the newly elected Labor Party was going to be looking closely at the programs within scope of the FRS sector, those funded by the Department of Social Services and the Attorney General's Department, we wanted to be able to show them in economic terms the value of our services, and in turn have a resource available for our members to use when speaking with their own stakeholders about the value of these services. As our speakers will outline, our ability to do this work was heavily reliant on your work in programs. By capturing information about the people you work with and contributing to DEX and SCORE, we were able to extract vital information to undertake the cost-benefit analysis. And I also wish to extend my thanks to the Department of Social Services and the Attorney General's Department for allowing us to do that. In addition, we relied on you. We relied on you as our members to collect information via a survey. And we know that you had survey fatigue, especially during the pandemic period. The survey informed the piece of work that I am most grateful to all of you for. That survey information contributed a great deal to the final report. So what I am also proud to share with our delegates today is an economic picture of the value of the family and relationship sector. Direct from the key authors, the independent report themselves, Sarina Lacey and Dennis McCarthy. So Sarina leads the CIE Health Economics and Policy Practice. She has 25 years consulting experience advising government and non-government clients on policy and funding issues in the health and human services sector to achieve better value health and human services care. Associate Director Dennis McCarthy is an experienced economist focusing on cost-benefit analysis and analytical modelling, covering a range of sectors such as healthcare, disability and social services. This yields insights that cut across policy areas, particularly for valuing well-being and social impacts. Please join me in welcoming Sarina and Dennis, who will speak to the topic demonstrating the value of family and relationship services and economic value.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having us here today. We're delighted to be invited to speak to you, and particularly to understand that this conference theme is really about the value in what you bring and what you do on a day-to-day basis. It's possible we're the only two economists in the room, so don't worry, we won't frighten you with the gobbledygook of stuff that we always do, because it's a pleasure to be able to talk to people that are actually delivering these services, day to day on the ground. And we hope that, the overview that we're going to give you of the work that we've done helps to give you kind of happiness and confidence and, a really great sense of contribution as to the work that you do. Because this piece of work was quite unique. It really was method-wise. We'll talk about, Dennis is going to come and talk to you about that, about how this study is probably the first of its kind in many ways in studies like this that have been done. So it really was a great opportunity to use all the data that you painstakingly have contributed to develop a piece of work like this. So just as a little bit of an overview as to what we're going to talk about, we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the tasks that we had in front of us, the kind of outcomes that we have measured, how we've done that translation piece from looking at the changes that your work has delivered to how they can be financially assessed, how we've kind of brought those together in a cost-benefit framework, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. Okay, so our task, as Teresa said, is to do a cost-benefit analysis. So that's the framework that we used. It's probably the quintessential and best framework for kind of policy analysis in general, extremely well established, and is a discipline to be very holistic and evidence-based in thinking about the impact of different programs, because cost-benefit analysis is used to make decisions about whether to proceed with something, whether something's been effective, whether it needs to pivot, etc. So it really is about being quite specific about the evidence that can be brought to bear about what a particular program or a set of services is delivering. Because we all know that, you know, we all live within a budget envelope of some description, and there are plenty of ways to skin a cat. So you need to use cost-benefit analysis to say, are we getting the most from the resources that we have? And that's what the framework is really about. And so not only is it a discipline of thinking about what you're delivering and what that's worth relative to the costs, but it's also a process about being really open and transparent around what the limitations are in the evidence and how you accommodate those and recognise those in the method. So that's what we did, and the included programs are listed on the screen from Family Law Services and Families and Children Activity, most of which are still in progress at the moment, in place at the moment. So our approach was initially collaborative and based on existing evidence, and then had a whole new piece of new evidence. So just in terms of that first sort of phase of work, we were very lucky to have the opportunity to run a workshop at the start of the engagement with some of the people that are in this room at the Strategic Leaderships Forum probably about 12 months or so ago, to think about what the impact pathway kind of looks like for the work that you do. So it's not just about having funding and doing activities, but it's about thinking really holistically about what the objectives are and what you need to go and look for to know that you're getting there with the money that you're getting and the things that you're doing with that money. So thinking about kind of the broad set of impacts from safety to health to financial returns, a whole range of kind of different things, and thinking about how is what we do valuable, why is it valuable? And then thinking about, well, how do we get there? Because we didn't want to go off and start collecting data and looking at literature on the wrong things. We needed to make sure that we were really kind of focused in what we were doing. So we did those workshops and got that sort of set of guidance early on in the process with your help. Then we went and did our thing looking at the literature, and then we developed quite specific program logics from refining the work that had already been done in this room, and used that to be very specific around how the method had to be developed. So what money was going where, what was being done, who was using your services, what benefits were they getting, why were they getting those benefits relative to something else, and thinking about all the kind of the ways, the kinds of benefits that accessing your services sort of delivers. So I'm just going to pass to Dennis, who's going to talk to you about the new evidence piece.
Thanks, Sarina. So the first key piece of new evidence comes in the form of the DEX data. The DEX data was really fantastically useful for us in the project. The first key thing it led us to do was measure the number of clients, the amount of service activity that's occurring, which obviously in a cost-benefit analysis framework, you need to be thinking about how much of whatever it is that you're trying to do are you actually doing, and therefore what it costs. We also use this data, we use the score data specifically to analyse what changes were occurring between the beginning of when people receive services and the end. This is one way to be able to understand what's the causal impact, or what's really the change that services are driving for people. However, this was also supplemented by looking at other evidence. We were able to analyse a number of longitudinal data sets, basically data sets of the same people repeatedly over multiple years. We analysed two data sets. The first of them was the longitudinal study of Australian children, which was particularly useful in looking at mental distress and child development, and where we were able to find significant impacts of receiving services on these outcomes. Secondly, we analysed the HILDA dataset, which is more broad in its scope, analysing or collecting data on the same households repeatedly over many years, more than 20 years now. What we were able to do there was to look at a measure of what's called subjective wellbeing or life satisfaction, effectively one measure that captures how satisfied they are with their circumstances at the time. and I'll talk about that a little later. The last step in all of this was to put it together. That's where the kind of the formal cost-benefit analysis bit comes in, but I'd stress that all the previous bits really don't have so much of, they're not necessarily economic analysis. These are things that can be done in other kinds of analysis as well. But where the economics comes in is we say, what are the outcomes that we see people are getting? How much does it cost? And let's compare those two things and see what kind of the net return is. The other thing we do in that step is we turn impacts on people's well-being into a dollar value. But critically, that's not saying what's the financial dollars and cents kind of change to government spending and that sort of thing only. Really, it's critically about how are individuals doing in various aspects of their life and how do they feel about their life circumstances, and putting that into a dollar value. This slide is perhaps a little cheekily worded. We know that there's limitations with DEX. But for us, really, we thought it did some really good things for us. So the choice of method for the study was designed to try and maximise what we saw as a great opportunity to use this data. The score data in particular, as part of what's collected through DEX, we selected that as the best source of insight into client wellbeing. As Sarina's highlighted, this came at the end of a process of looking at other evidence, obviously including the literature. We did analyse other longitudinal data sets and so on, but DEX has some really key advantages. Firstly, it's detailed and broad. It covers a wide range of client outcomes. It also covered all the in-scope programs, and we had specific data about each of those. We knew that a key thing in this study was to try and tell the story of the different programs that are being provided, and so the longitudinal data sets just weren't enough. They didn't go to the level of being able to say what's happening with different programs. Since 21-22, all organisations have been required to report client circumstances for a majority of their identified clients. Additionally, we were able to compare earliest and latest observations for client score, which is one way to look at the causal impact of services. It's obviously not the only way, and we did look at those longitudinal data sets and other evidence. To our knowledge, it's the first time the data set's been used, at least in this sort of way, to underpin a cost-benefit analysis, in particular a public one. We thought it was a great opportunity. Just to highlight kind of the breadth of what DEX was able to tell us, and to highlight that the results reflect the latest available evidence at the time the study was completed on cost and activity. About 1.3 million sessions of client care in 2021-22, almost 500,000 clients were provided with one session of care at least in that financial year, and almost $600 million of committed funding in the most recent financial year used in the study. We worked out about $1,200 in the average cost of support. That's sort of the grant funding amount of support per client in the financial year that we studied in the analysis. And we also found that there was an increase in dollars per client over the last 5 years of data that we had available. How do we measure and value impacts? So using the score data, we've got this really consistent measure across the range of programs that exist. And we critically have that data about the earliest score observation for each individual and the latest score observation. We then had a different methodology depending on what impact area we were looking at. Clearly, age-appropriate development and family functioning are critical impact areas for many programs. And for that, actually, score information wasn't the only relevant thing. We really wanted to rely on two really good studies from the literature, which looked at these impacts in kind of a long-term, a lifetime sense, because clearly there's impacts beyond, well beyond the time frame of programs. For all other domains, I mentioned life satisfaction, or this subjective wellbeing measure. We used the HILDA data set to link changes in score to changes in that subjective wellbeing measure. So that measure, what it is, I've got the question there. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life? And pick a number between 0 and 10 to indicate how satisfied you are. And obviously, as economists, we love numbers, and so the fact that we can put this into a numeric form is really essential to be able to do this work that we're doing. We have a value for a 1-point improvement for a year in that measure, in particular in the UK, also New Zealand, but it's also being used increasingly in Australia. You know, Sarina's mentioned this is kind of really at the coalface of economic analysis. There's a normed value that you can place on improvements in subjective wellbeing. Really, the key thing that we had to link is, well, a change in score for housing, how much is that worth in terms of how much is that going to affect someone's overall life satisfaction? And that's where the HILDA data set came in, that we could say, for example, 1-point improvement in personal safety score corresponds to a 0.2 point improvement in the overall life satisfaction measure. In terms of family law services, also we had to capture the benefits of court diversion, and there's a good, very recent 2023 study by PwC about, among other things, the avoided court costs from family dispute resolution. So what we relied on there was also data from DEX about the number of Section 60I certificates that were issued to try and estimate, consistent with the other studies in the literature. This is kind of more well-worn footing, I'd say, for the study. How much court diversion would occur, and therefore the savings that arise from that. Sarina.
So I guess the upshot of all of that is that we're not just looking at money in the bank, we're looking at how you value a change in someone's well-being, and I would say at about time too. So it's different ways of getting to that point, and that's really kind of what you want to achieve. So the next couple of slides really talks about what the changes in the score data was. I know that there are issues that people have with score, but we wanted to put that slide up to show you how big the data set was. I mean, it's a fabulous data set for doing tops-down stuff, right? Doing bottoms-up stuff, sometimes good, sometimes difficult to get around, but we've used it in a tops-down sense, and we've made adjustments to the model where we needed to reflect some of the limitations in the data. We had a lot of data, and this is a really consistent story of looking at what the improvements are in well-being in these different outcome measures. So family functioning is almost off the charts. So, this is a score out of 5, and family functioning's, almost consistently around the 20% improvement mark across all programs. I mean, that's really outstanding. None of these, nothing on this slide is negative. Everything's positive. Everything has made a difference across all domains. So, and that's what the evidence shows you. When we're looking at the impact of families and children's activity, the changes, again, nothing's negative, and there are some real peaks in where we saw changes in access to a whole range of different programs, particularly age-appropriate development, family functioning, and mental health, wellbeing, and self-care. So this is a really good news story stuff, and this is just from analysis of the score data. It's not necessarily a cost-benefit analysis proper. Looking at the community score, so where there was group activity, whilst we didn't actually use it in the cost-benefit model for various reasons that are in the report because of the limitations to it, at the end of the day, you still saw really terrific improvements across the board, across all the programs for participation in that group activities. So, in some cases, sort of like a 2.5 out of 5 is a 50% improvement, which is just, pretty dramatic. So it just kind of adds to that good news story that's come out of that data set. So where did that get us to at the end of the day? Super strong results. When you've got data that can demonstrate an improvement in wellbeing across a range of different important social domains, and you've got the literature and the evidence available to value some of those changes in wellbeing, we really do have a terrific news story that came out of the report. So the net return was $1.4 billion every year for family law services, and $2.2 billion every year for families and children's activity, which is really outstanding. And I've been in this game quite a long time, and you don't often see results like this. And usually when I see results like this, I'm like, something's got to be wrong. Let's dig a bit deeper. cut something out. And this is where we got cut to. These are really great results. And I guess a lot of that sort of speaks to, probably from your perspective, it might be a little bit frustrating in a way because so much of the value of what you do isn't necessarily in the budget numbers, right? So it's just the impact that you have on lives. And that's why these numbers are really big, because those sorts of things that don't ordinarily get captured in the money in the bank type stuff is just absolutely really critical and important to the individuals and the wider community. So the cost-benefit ratios, which just basically compares costs and benefits together, they range from 2.5 to 21.9, which means that for every dollar spent, the least value was $2.50 return, and the most valuable was $21.9 return. So absolutely staggering. And just because, we are bean counters and we do like to get numbers really strong and robust, we did test these numbers in as many ways as we could to look at worst case kind of scenarios, and they all came out with the benefits exceeding the costs. So from a value side, you're doing brilliant work, you should be so proud of it, and it's really sort of outstanding value that's been created. So.
So now just talking about the split between family law services and the families and children's activity, you can see here for family law services, what were the biggest drivers? Age-appropriate development and family functioning are some of the biggest impacts that programs are having. A lot of that is because these sort of impact streams deliver lifelong impacts, far in the future across a range of other domains. So even if programs don't have an immediate impact on, obviously, something like a housing outcome, later in life there's certainly impacts that are borne out, again and again in the literature that we feel we're reliably able to attribute to sort of improvements that the programs are delivering. There's also impacts across a range of other impact categories. Mental health and wellbeing is a significant one. Again, personal and family safety clearly is an important outcome, particularly for some programs. The avoided cost of family court is significant. That's possibly the more traditional sort of benefit that you see arising in cost-benefit analysis for programs like this. And I'd make the point that you could look at the program either from a wellbeing perspective, in which case those wellbeing benefits outweigh the costs of 0.2 billion, or just on an avoided cost perspective, in which case the benefits there outweigh the costs as well. So really on either basis, and obviously on both, family law services are delivering a positive net return. In terms of the families and children's activity, we see even more of the benefit share being age-appropriate development and family functioning. That did vary quite a lot across different programs. Another point I'd make is that there's maybe a risk that we're counting the same sort of thing with age-appropriate development and family functioning measures. So to be conservative in that respect, we only picked one or the other for each program, which I think highlights that there's quite a few ways really in the study where we've sought to be conservative, and that's one of them. Other key impact pathways: community participation and networks, housing, mental health and wellbeing again, and personal and family safety. You can see the net benefit that Sarina mentioned there of 2.2 billion per year, which is certainly significant. In terms of the way this splits across programs, there's quite a lot of variation. As Sarina's mentioned, it's all above one, suggesting that we didn't find any programs that weren't paying themselves off in terms of the benefits that they're delivering. Family law services overall delivering somewhat less benefits than the families and children's activity. That's probably some of the families and children's activity services deliver outsized benefits. Specialised family violence services in particular give big benefits to people's feelings of safety, and there's just a very clear relationship between that and how people rate themselves in terms of their personal well-being. I'd also highlight that this is not including some of the other costs of improving safety outcomes. What we were looking at was how do people feel about their situation of feeling safe. But obviously there's a lot of cost to government even when safety outcomes are bad. That wasn't captured. Our study was mainly focused on wellbeing outcomes, and hence again an aspect in which we're being conservative.
So you saw at the program level the range of returns that have been shown, and it is variable. One thing I would say is don't worry too much about the variation. It doesn't mean you take all your money out of programs that have got a 2.5 and put them towards the one that's at 22. That's not what it's meant to be about. The overall story is that they're all really beneficial and different. Like if we're doing this from a bottom, they're different. Therefore, different people in different circumstances. So, when you're doing hard-hitting type programs and you're making dramatic lifetime changes for families, you're going to count up more wellbeing benefits, but not everybody's in that situation. And some people across, the programs cater to people from a range of different situations. So don't get hung up in they're double, I'm half, or whatever. That's not the point of it. The point is great news story across the board. And as the evidence builds around whether it's using the DEX data or as a literature around valuing wellbeing measures develops as it is now, then you would expect some of those, all these programs from a bottoms-up perspective just to be in a position to be better evaluated over time. So it's one little extra.
Thank you, Sarina and Dennis. I think you heard a collective laugh as well as a sigh, which gives you our thoughts on DEX. It's no secret. I think that probably was clear in your research with every organisation that participated in the surveys. I think the overview that you've provided there with the data is a really good narrative analysis, and it's a story we should continue to sell. And so that report that you've all got access to is really important to sell in our own communities with the people who have a very strong voice in your communities to advocate advocate our position of the worth and the work that these programs actually have. I think the add value work that we do, so we have the funded work, but we know there's a lot of added value that we also provide. And in economic terms, you speak about mental health and well-being. It also is interesting about what would that impact look like if we were to stretch across silos, across other areas outside of our sector as well. And I think that's also a critical piece to keep in mind when we talk about our advocacy piece as well. We do have an opportunity for you to ask questions of our guests here this morning. So we've got roving mics in the room.
Hi, it's Graham Westaway from Better Place Australia. My question is, I think historically the practice of what our services do has been pinged by the family violence sector in terms of a perception that it facilitates collusion and other undesirable effects in practice. However, these results very strongly indicate quite the contrary, and I'm wondering, is this a good advocacy platform for us to be putting forth to government decision makers in terms of where funding should be directed?
Yeah, I think certainly as I'd mentioned, the findings in terms of safety and family violence outcomes were really, really strong, and we do think that there's a role for this in being able to advocate for more funding for the sector. I'd probably emphasise a little bit of the caution that Sarina did about interpreting too closely some of the results for specific programs. Some benefits, even in the wellbeing space, are easier to measure than others. One example is employment outcomes, where programs are delivering better employment outcomes. You'd think that would be a bit easier to measure, but the impact of employment on people's wellbeing is really individual specific, quite difficult actually. But yeah, certainly we'd see that as part of the role of the study.
More of a comment than a question. I'm from Communities for Children. Yeah, this means family. It's quite reassuring that the program is delivering positive impact to children and families. But I'm quite interested in the budget-based funded program. What are they doing differently? And because they have the highest impact, returns.
Yeah, definitely that one comes out really outsized. I'd say that a lot of that is on the cost side. If I recall correctly, I think budget-based funded was lower in terms of per client costs. But to some extent, the score data is what it is. We see what the average changes are, and then we can convert that into a result. I think that's probably the next level of detail down, which is to be able to see, well, what is it exactly about the characteristic of this service compared to that one that is giving you the different size of impact. Certainly something worth doing. I think it's probably a little bit beyond what we can see given the kind of data that we had in this study.
I think it's fabulous data. I'm interested to know what appetite you think government has to receive this, because I've seen this kind of data in other spaces, and I'm wondering about where this is pitched to actually get, well, perhaps, of course, funding, obviously, policy and program integration and all those sorts of elements. I'm just wondering where this gets pitched at the state and Commonwealth as well.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it probably comes back to something that we said initially. I mean, exercises like this are very helpful in a policy context because money is not infinite, and priorities need to be made, decisions need to be made about future funding, etc. So, and there is, an important governance, a framework around those decisions, and they need to be evidence-based. So it can be nothing but helpful. So it's just getting the data to the best quality that you can get it, and making adjustments to your calculations to allow for what you know to be limitations in data, and putting the best evidence forward. So, it's more that, if you don't have something like this, it just makes that job even harder, because the expectation is that you will have it, because that's what all the other services across, all the other portfolios are doing. I mean, cost-benefit analysis is driving policy decisions. So it's really kind of a fundamental piece, I think, in that regard. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've maybe just got one other thing to add, which I think, as we've said a few times, one of the unique parts of this study was really the wellbeing focus. Obviously, we're not the first to do that, particularly in the UK. It's quite advanced, and I think that a key thing in cost-benefit analysis is measuring what really matters to people. I think sometimes there's a tendency to think about just the cost to government, for example, what's going to save government the most, but obviously this part of government service delivery is spending more money than, it's not intended to be just about saving government money. So, you know, I think it's really critical to do work that focuses on the key things that it's actually delivering for people.
Karen Field from Drummond Street Services. I was just interested in whether you looked at all over a number of years the real costs of running these programs, because I think in terms of the FARS and the family law sector, there's been little new funding, new investment, or even keeping up, pace with the actual real costs, even with kind of shades of water increases, which we're delighted for our staff to get. The real costs of rents and everything else are kicking in incredible ways. So we're actually doing the same with less and less and less. And I think that's a real issue.
Yeah, maybe the quick comment is just that, yeah, I think there are probably some aspects of costs that we're leaving out. Also, to the extent that, you know, staff at service providers are taking things on themselves and you know, there's cost there that we might miss. We don't think it'd kind of affect the fact that the programs obviously have merit, but yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you everyone for those questions, and I'm being redirected to one more.
I'm Rachel Reynolds from Uniting Care. I love the data and I love data generally. As a children's counsellor working for the Supporting Children After Separation program, I love it when I hear that my families aren't actually going to proceed through the court process. And I'm wondering, when you consider the cost of living, has that been factored into the methodology around it is very expensive to go to court? And whilst we do a fabulous work with our families, we can't always say that that work has completely stopped them from going through the court process. It's incredibly expensive, and that is also a deterrent. Is that in the data? How does that look? Yeah, thanks.
I think there's probably a little bit of a view that we get of it. It's a good point. When we look at the earliest score observation to the latest, I think part of the reason that people often their wellbeing is quite low at the start of the process, obviously it's the nature of the situation, but it's probably also in the family law context the daunting prospect of all those financial costs, and you know, I think increasingly that's going to bite for people. We were looking at data over quite a few years. I think we had back to 2016 in terms of when the first score observation was. Potentially, if you looked at data, particularly people receiving services more recently, you'd see even more of that impact. You'd think that would start to really have an impact recently. So yeah, it's in there in part.
Please join me in thanking Sarina as well as Dennis.